Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. All right, folks. So welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. And I could not be more honored. I have Barbara Oakley here, folks. I mean, how amazing is that? So thank you so much for saying yes, Barbara.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Andre. And so I'm just very happy to be here, even though I'm not here. I'm sort of there, wherever
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
You are in Wellington, you told me, right? So that's really
Yes.
far away from where I am right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a beautiful day. Wellington is actually the windiest city on Earth, but
Really?
today it's rather calm. So I'm very happy.
Wow, amazing. And let me tell you something that when I started the podcast, I had no idea I'd be talking to people like you, and I've interviewed Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork and John Sweller, Henry Roediger, and amazing people who have done so much, who've written so much about how we learn. So yeah, I think I'm doing something right. I must be doing something right.
It's exactly right, because those are towering figures who have done so much to help put learning and education and pedagogy on a rock solid foundation. So it makes me feel good to just be following in their footsteps.
Wonderful. So, Barbara, let's start with perhaps a thought-provoking question. I like to ask my guests about the importance of science, especially in education. I feel like a lot of us teach based more on intuition, on ritual, tradition, or whatever you want to call it. And some teachers are actually scared that science wants to, I don't know, maybe dictate what they have to do in class. So what do you have to tell them? Do you think science, I know you do, but is science important for educators, and why?
I think the first thing we should do is just step back in time to the 1800s, before medicine was put on a solid research footing. And at that time, surgeons who delivered babies thought that it was not important to wash their hands.
Oh, yes.
And they were adamant that they were gentlemen, that they had clean hands, that there wasn't, and you could not show them the data and convince them that they should do anything different in their practice, because they were convinced that they knew the proper thing. And sometimes I think, it's a natural human tendency, especially if you grow older. Sometimes I think the worst aspect of human intelligence, if you want to call it intelligence, is inflexibility in the face of data. And people will, if they don't want to hear something, they will completely ignore anything that, goes against what they feel is right. And this is one of the worst aspects of human ways of thinking about things. And it's not really intelligence. In fact, there is good research that reveals that one of the worst, aspects of, that when major figures die in the history of science, all of a sudden, after that major figure dies, there is often a flourishing of new ideas in the discipline, because it turns out that major figures can completely block new approaches to learning. And we see that time and time again. We have seen that even recently. For example, it's what I call a paradigm cartel.
Yes.
Um, and that is that in um, in Alzheimer's research, it was thought that the only reason for Alzheimer's, it was primarily amyloid plaques, this gunk that builds up between neurons. And if you tried to get funding for, any other kind of research, if you tried to even write a paper about it, it was difficult to even get published. The major journal editors, all the top figures in the field, people who gave out the monies, you could not go anywhere if you didn't fall in line with it's only amyloid plaque.
Yeah.
And it turns out that blocked advances in the entire field for over 30 years. And
Wow.
what's worse is it seems that some of those initial studies that were amyloid plaque supportive appear to have been quite flagrantly falsified.
Wow.
So you might say, well, yeah, but that's just one field. They circled the wagons, but it isn't like that elsewhere. You will see paradigm cartels practically wherever you look, and it is deeply pernicious in the field of education. In that field, unfortunately, professors of education are taught early on that student-centered constructivist approaches to learning are really the be-all and end-all. And I have gone to National Science Foundation and been told, if you are putting forth a grant proposal that espouses practice and repetition in learning math, I'm sorry, don't even bother to submit it because we will not fund it. But you might say, well, the teacher says, but my students are happier with these constructivist approaches, student-centered and so forth. Now, I'll put it to you this way. If I was to teach air guitar, I could really get my students super excited about air guitar. They get up in front of the class.
Definitely.
They're doing fun stuff. They get to fake, really those riffs and everything. And then, the class is cheering and they would do a survey at the end of that class and their students would love it.
Oh, definitely.
They're not learning the guitar. The guitar is something really different, and it involves some dedicated practice and learning. But teachers do not know that simply doing a survey and having happy students is not the same as having students that really know the subject matter. If you look at Jaime Escalante, who was the star of the movie Stand and Deliver, he was a Bolivian teacher who came to teach many of these students in Southern California were the children of immigrant farm workers. And his biggest struggle, actually, was with the administration, who felt that, you can't have high expectations. These kids, they already have things too difficult. They can't. And when he held them to high standards, they loved it. They did so exceptionally well. He himself said the thing that the movie got wrong was they compressed the time span into 1 year, and it actually took 3 years for him to be able to get these kids.
It takes time,
So, I think there's real confusion. Teachers feel like having happy students is their job. And, and it is nice to have happy students. But underneath that, it needs to be growing from students actually getting the solid foundation in whatever that subject is that's being taught. And that is vitally important.
That's so important, Barbara. What you're telling me, and I talked to the Bjorks, Bob and Liz Bjork, and they talk about desirable difficulties, for example, which is aligned with what you're saying. I've talked to John Donlowski, for example, who told me that learning is difficult. Learning is difficult. But there seems to be a narrative that people bought that they have to make it easier for everyone. And it feels that that's really detrimental to learning. I feel like, students, they have to be encouraged all the time. They have to be motivated all the time. And everything has to be engaging. But that doesn't really work if you're not doing the work, right? Does that make sense?
It is not only does that make sense, that is such an important point. My own research shows that if you look there, James Flynn demonstrated from the 1930s to the 70s, IQ scores went up. They've been rising. And when researchers went and looked at this, they said, well, it's education systems that have really made the difference and, in some sense, improved cognition. But from the 1970s to today, in Western countries only, there's been a substantive decline in IQ scores.
Yeah.
And it's directly correlated with these, the inculcation within the educational system of this idea. You can always just look it up. Yeah. You don't need to remember things. When you don't remember things, it actually interferes with the development of your schema, your underlying neural sense of intuition and expertise about things. And so you can clearly see that those countries that have adopted constructivist, student-centered approaches that discourage any kind of memorization. In fact, they've almost made it into this anathema that memorization does not equate to understanding. But I will put this to you. So I was teaching my engineering class. I handed back a big midterm. And one of my students came marching up to me. He'd flunked the test quite roundly. And he waves it in my face and he says, how could I have flunked this test? I understood it when you said it in class. We've gotten so crazily overboard that conceptual understanding is the only golden key to learning, that we are completely sailing by the point that if you can't remember what you've learned, you have not learned it. I don't speak Mandarin Chinese if I'm just using Google Translate to look it up for me.
Of course. You
need to have that expertise within you to become. For years I had arguments with a good friend who said, no, you don't need to remember things. Open book tests are fine, blah, blah, blah. And then finally, I reminded him that his memory is so good that when he was getting his Ph.D. at Princeton, he would go in, take tests, walk out, write the whole test and all the answers down, and then it would be put on file for his fraternity.
Yeah.
And of course, he thinks it's not important to remember things because it's no problem for him to remember,
Sure.
And sometimes these really brilliant people just don't know what an ordinary person like me needs to do to be able to become proficient in whatever I'm learning.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, you actually had quite an intense experience learning languages back in the day when you started. I think you joined the military, if I'm not wrong. You went to the Defense Language Institute, right? Is that the one, the DEF, I think, Defense Foreign Language Institute? Yeah, that's one of the toughest courses on the planet, apparently. I don't know. I mean, it's the whole day, lots of homework, apparently, many hours of study. So can you tell us a little bit about that the struggle to learn a language, because it seems like everyone online today, Instagram gurus, as I like to call them, they're selling a quick, fast solution to learning languages. It doesn't really work like that unless you put in a lot of hours, right?
That's so true. There are a few people who have extraordinary memories, and there's a different set of genetically based characteristics that can allow you, even as an adult, to acquire a good accent in another language. So there's these few rare language sponges that make it, hard for all the rest of us. But I was lucky in that I attended the Defense Language Institute, DLI, in Monterey, California. I picked Russian completely at random.
Yeah.
And, and the thing is, once I learned how to learn a language, which I learned because there are really good teaching techniques there. Then when I applied those same techniques to learning in math and science, suddenly what I thought I could not learn as a young person, the doors opened for me. Now I'm a distinguished professor of engineering, and I'm telling you, if my math instructors in 7th grade or 12th grade ever had any idea that I could be capable of this, they would still not believe it. But the thing is, I wondered for many years, how could learning languages help me in learning in math and science? And it's only when I began, the thing is, a lucky break for me is that when I decided to try to learn something more mathematically oriented, I centered on electrical engineering. And I did that mostly because it was kind of like, if there was ever anything completely alien to me as a human being, it's becoming an electrical engineer.
Sure. Yeah.
I would never have thought I could do it. But knowing electrical engineering is really a good foundation for understanding a lot of the insights that are unfolding from neuroscience and how we really learn, which often involves circuits and how connections are being made in the brain, even sometimes more than the biochemistry involved in, dendritic spines and neurotransmitters and transmission and so forth. If you can understand the underlying circuitry, the engineering, so to speak, of what's going on, you can, even if you're not a neuroscientist, you can pick out the key ideas of what's going on. So that's when I began studying neuroscience, and I began to realize that, wait a minute, there's two key learning systems in the brain. It just makes me laugh. Just one psychologist recently just did a video, and it's like, there's only one learning system in the brain, and we all learn the same. And it's like, and he kept showing the intestinal system. As we only have one set of intestines, and that's how we process.
Sure.
And I had to so laugh, because I'm like, okay, well, if it is only one system, why are you still showing, our digestive system? You're not showing the learning system. And he's not showing the learning system because it's far more complex than one single digestive system. And because he's a psychologist, he really doesn't get that. You have to get the underlying neuroscience. The reality is, and I'm simplifying quite a bit here, but there are two major pathways by which the brain learns. One uses that hippocampal system. So this system is a very, it's flexible. You use it to learn things like your, like a conjugation system, or to figure out steps in a mathematical problem. But the other system is that system of habits. And of learning without you being aware that you're learning. And that's the basal ganglia. Like, I hit a baseball, I hit it again and again and again, and I gradually learned to hit the baseball, but I have no idea
Yeah.
what my brain is doing when I'm doing that learning. I'm not conscious of it. These two different learning systems do different things in our learning. So let's say I'm trying to figure out a math problem, like 12 times 13. Well, I might go, 12 times 12 is 144. That's that automatic basal ganglia system.
Yeah.
Now add one more 12, and that gives me the right answer. That's my declarative hippocampal. So I'm using both of them. If I'm reading, I might be able to, parse the words instantly using that basal ganglia system, unless I have dyslexia, and that basal ganglia system may not work as well. But then I put together the understanding of what that paragraph means through that declarative hippocampal system. So anyway, learning how the brain learns is really important, and teachers should know this because they need to know how to teach to different systems, so that they need to know that something should be learned by heart.
Yeah.
Because that gives an underlying sense of the patterns, which is why if I said 12 times 12 is 289, you kind of go, what? That intuitive pattern. Now, the same thing happens in language. If I said, I goed to the store yesterday, you would know that that was wrong in English. Could you explain why? No, of course not. You don't know why, but you know what's right. It's the same in math. Some kids who learn through that basal ganglia automatic system know when they can instantly intuit answers to problems. But what do we do with these neuroatypical students? We say, well, if you can't explain it to me, you don't really understand it. And it's just like, well, if I told you that goat is wrong, but I can't explain it, somehow that's right, but I got to do it for math. We actually turn off really talented students because they might have a neuroatypical way of looking at things. And, all of these challenges arise simply because we do not teach, schools of pedagogy teach virtually nothing about the brain except the amygdala mixture nervous, or neuromys. It's just kind of tangential information that isn't really of great value, like what neuroscience could be if it was taught properly in schools of education.
Yeah, Barbara, that's so true, and that brings me to I think the first book I read that you wrote was A Mind for Numbers, and how you flunked algebra and how you can learn math despite flunking algebra, and I think that was the book, if I'm not mistaken, that I learned. And then there was a great course that you did for Coursera, I think, with Terry Sinowski, right? It was learning how to learn, so I took that one too. And in a way, you inspired me to pursue a career because when I applied for a scholarship, I got a scholarship to go to England to get my master's degree in psychology of education. So thank you so much for the inspiration. Yeah, and but what I'm trying to get at is that you introduced the idea of focused versus diffuse modes of thinking, right? That those are two different systems as well. So can you tell us a little bit about what's the difference? Why is that important? How does that affect learning?
See, if I'd known this early on, it really could have changed my life. And it's just such a simple idea. But to ground this in what we see around us every day, if you look at a bird from an evolutionary perspective, for it to be able to survive and pass along its genes, it's got two dramatically different tasks. The first task is it's got to be able to focus and peck on a seed. But the second one is is something going to come out of the air and kill me?
Yeah.
And it needs to be able to do both of these very different tasks. It is thought, it's hypothesized that one reason that we have two hemispheres in the brain is that one tends to be more involved in these focusing activities, and that is often the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere is more involved in that, what's going on around me, sort of broad ranging. And indeed, it is, it's not like each part of the brain only does one thing. And that's why neuroscientists they get their knickers in a knot when you start saying, I'm left brain or
Yes.
I'm right brain, because you got to have both parts of your brain. But for example, music often seems to be more right-centered, and focusing on doing a math problem or writing is left brain.
Yeah.
So that gets down to the very idea that there are different parts of the brain that activate when we are either focusing or we're daydreaming, mind wandering. And they're very different sets of circuits. That focused activity, focused mode, it's called by psychologists the task positive network, because that's usually when you're focusing on a task. And then that more broad-ranging, mind-wandering, daydreaming is called by psychologists the task negative network, or neuroscientists will call it the default mode
network. Yeah.
And what happens is when we're learning something, we always think that it's only when we're focusing that we're learning. But in reality, you often need to focus, especially as an adult when you're first learning something. But then when you go into that little bit of mind wandering, that helps you to consolidate and strengthen what you've just been learning about. So an interesting insight is, I love the Pomodoro technique.
Oh, yes.
And part of that is because it's a very simple technique. You just you get rid of all distractions, so no pop-ups on your computer. And then you set a timer for 25 minutes. Focus as intently as you can for those 25 minutes. If your mind wanders, just bring it back. It's like a working meditation. And then take about a 5-minute break, but do not pick up your cell phone.
Yes.
And the reason for that is when you are mind wandering, you're not allowing new information to come into your head, no working memory input. That helps your brain to be able to tag the information you've just been learning and so it tags it, and then later when you're sleeping, your brain has traveling waves that are going over and over in your brain. And they're in some sense looking for those tags. And when they go over and over and they say, tag right there, I'm going to reinforce it. But if you pick up your cell phone, instead of just giving yourself a break, no tag, no additional learning when you're going to sleep.
Yeah, and let me ask you something since you're here, because I normally tell my students when I ask them to take a break. We call it a brain break, right? Like you said, we will do some focused work for around 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll take a quick break. I normally ask them to go do something like nothing. Basically, go pet your cat or dog, water your plants, or, make yourself some tea or something like that. It's kind of like that. Try to just, don't focus on anything in particular. Just let your mind go, and then that should work, right?
You are doing the best advice possible. And they can have a little fun with it and see if they can feel the learning taking place. To me, sometimes I'll look up from a book I've just been reading. Maybe I'm on a train and I look out at the scenery, and it almost feels like I can feel that little hippocampus going, okay, I'm going to reinforce information now. I'm sure that's all imaginary, but it's actually happening.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you wrote many other great books, Barbara. And I wanted to talk about, so you wrote Mind Shift, right? Learning how to
Right?
learn, uncommon sense teaching, I think. So, what are the 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 insights you can share with us about how learning actually takes place in the brain and the mind? Because I was talking to many other guests, and most of them said that learning, or at least how we think we learn, is usually wrong, or actually learning is more counterintuitive because we don't really know what we can do to make learning more effective and lasting, let's say. So what insights can you share with us about how we actually learn, really learn?
Supposed to be an expert in learning, right? I will read a paper and I'll go, okay, this is so easy. I've got this. And when you are looking at something, when it's right in front of your eyes, you have this illusion of competence
Yeah.
that it is in your long term memory when it is actually only in your working memory. I have a good friend who devised a flashcard system. And what he did was he was going to medical school and he never took notes and he hardly ever went to class.
Huh.
He would just watch videos if they were available or read textbooks, but he wouldn't do a bunch of underlining and so forth in his textbooks. He would simply make flashcards out of all the important stuff, no notes, just flashcards. And do you know that in this way he graduated number one in his class?
Wow, look at
Which
that.
kind of tells you also that, good face-to-face teaching is not all it's necessarily cracked up to be. It's what's going on in the learner's brain. And so we can fool ourselves really easily, but the foundation, the bottom line is simply check yourself.
Yeah.
Flashcards are a great way to do it. And you might say, well, that's only for trivial facts. It depends on what questions you ask. Michael Nielsen, for example, the physicist, would use retrieval practice to draw to mind a theorem that he was studying. So he would try to remember it and really analyze it in a visual way just by kind of remembering it.
Yeah.
And in this way, he came up with a whole new way of proving this theorem. So retrieval practice, it depends on what questions you ask. If you ask trivial questions like, what's the date of this? What's the date of that? But if you ask yourself, compare and contrast the French and the Russian revolutions, and you're thinking about that when you're going out for your walk, you are going to be pulling to mind and making connections, ideas that are really important to be thought of in deep and rich ways.
And it's interesting that most students will not really realize that and will use more ineffective strategies like, rereading their notes or something like that. So when I was talking to Domlowski, he published a very interesting paper in 2013, I think, about how, when asked, students really report very or low utility techniques, he called them. So rereading, summarizing, taking notes, but then not really elaborating on those notes or retrieving them, just rereading the notes. And it's, like I said, it's counterintuitive. How did you teach your students how to use those strategies? What were the outcomes? Can you tell us a little bit? Because I feel like we need to teach our students those things. They have to learn how they can apply those techniques, those strategies. But usually they feel like, okay, but that's not going to work because I've been learning this way for my whole life. This is how it works for me. So how do you do it? How do you break it to students that maybe they're not using the best possible strategies? Can you give us some tips?
First off, I think it's an indictment of the educational system that students will go from 12 to 18 years of education and never get a course on how their brain learns.
Yeah.
I mean, that is unimaginable to me. And I think it's critical that educational systems start rethinking things, because in this era of generative AI, it can be so easy and so seductive. And you hear all these blandishments coming from, you know, you can always look it up.
Yeah.
Says a Google scholar. You know, so you'll hear from
now you can
people
generate things, not even just look up. You can generate an entire essay if you want to, you know, with a single line of prompt, right? Yeah.
And if we're not careful, we're going to have an even further decline in IQ scores.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I even hear from educators, you know, people should be only learning the kinds of things that ChatGPT can't do. I'm like, good luck with that.
Yeah.
But we will have, if we're not careful, we will have an uneducated class of students, and the only ones that will be getting a good education are the wealthy. You know, who have I sometimes go around and I'm just amazed, because I'll go to these fantastic private schools and they really pay attention to the research and they're trying to give their students the best education. And so they do. But then that means that those who are not, they're publicly funded schools that are not led by administrators that are really looking at the latest and greatest insight, you know, that those kids are being taught in ways that actually cripple their ability to learn. So it's the thing I've done is, with Terry Sanowski, we've created this course, Learning How to Learn, to simply and easily convey these insights about effective learning. And it's, it's amazing. I mean, millions of people around the world have gained so much from this, but it should have been from schools of education.
Yeah.
If you had asked a school of education, I want you to come up with a course in learning how to learn, they would have given you 3 weeks on history of education, 3 more weeks on theories, often century or more year old theories of education, 3 more weeks on how babies learn, and a tiny little bit at the end on how do you really learn, but hardly any neuroscience, because that's too difficult. We flip that on its head. You can learn a lot of neuroscience by simply using metaphorical approaches. And neuroscience is really where it's all at, to understand what is happening in your brain when you're learning and how can you avoid fooling yourself. So that's what our course is all about. And of course, now we have Uncommon Sense Teaching to help teachers really understand these insights. And the response has been really, makes you pretty happy.
Yes. And you should be happy, because I really do think you've helped a lot of teachers out there, and myself included, you know, inspired a lot of people to learn more about the brain and the mind. But let me tell you something I've heard a couple of times. Teachers say that all of the, you know, the amazing contributions coming from neuroscience and cognitive psychology cannot be translated into, you know, practical teaching tips or anything like that, because they're very distant fields or something like that. So what would you have to say to those people who believe that?
Go watch Uncommon Sense Teaching and see what you walk away with. There's so much practical insight. Yeah, the problem is there is an underlying bias on the part of some educators and psychologists against neuroscience.
Yeah.
So what this means is they'll talk about neuroscience. I read a massive review study of neuroscience as it was taught in schools of education throughout the Western world. And do you know what they taught?
Huh.
Neuromyths. Neuromyths. It's like saying, I'm going to teach mathematics by teaching you myths about mathematics. I'm going to teach geology by teaching you myths and mistakes about geology. I mean, it's just goofy. Neuromyths is not teaching how the brain actually learns. I think a lot of it is, there is neuroscience. If you really look at it, it's easy to convey major ideas using metaphor.
Definitely.
And even simple ideas like you get connected clusters of links in long-term memory when you learn something. Those can be conveyed visually so easily, and people get it right off the bat. I think that the challenge has been that neuroscience itself is a really in-depth discipline. And those who are working in it are often, they're at the cutting edge of the research they're trying to do. And so it's hard to take a step back and say, how do I translate the basics of this discipline so that teachers can understand it? That's where I come in. And Terry is an immense help in, although he is right at the pinnacle of research in the field too. So sometimes I do feel like, okay, Terry, come off the mountaintop, and speak in terms, that are not a monk's koan for me to decipher. He's such a good sport about it. But there's just so much for people that is practically useful about, everything from the importance of retrieval practice and how concept mapping is not really the be all and end all, and focused and diffuse, and helping us understand neuroatypical students. It's a rich discipline.
Oh yes, most definitely. And you mentioned Terry, and I think he published a book about ChatGPT and AI quite recently, if I'm not mistaken. I really want to read that book. But he also published with you a paper that came out this year. I think the memory paradox, right? And why our brains need knowledge in an age of AI. And it came out maybe just a little before an MIT paper came out. They did they studied different strategies of, using ChatGPT or just using Google or just using your brain. They put the students on an EEG, right, to check for brain activity. So are you concerned at all, Barbara? You mentioned that maybe people in the future might actually, we can see the drop in IQ levels as it is. So are you concerned that this is maybe a tipping point for humanity if we keep using AI like that without really thinking, without applying effort, cognitive effort to actually learn things? Have you thought about that? Any thoughts?
Yeah. It's not a worldwide phenomenon. Some countries really understand and have at the pinnacle of their learning, of their education systems, people who really understand science and understand learning. And those countries are going to be doing better and better. Yeah. So you can't sit there and say, oh, everybody's going to do bad because of blah, blah. No. It's the countries that actually seize good knowledge about learning and incorporate that into their educational systems. And, the West needs to get a little bit of a wake-up call about the methods they're using and promulgating that can actually cripple students' abilities to learn. Some countries are not falling prey to these seductive, feel-good kinds of mentalities. And, and so we ignore good research from education or involving how we learn at our peril.
Yes, and we're moving towards the end of this chat. Like I say, I could spend the whole day here talking to you about this, but that also brings me to a very important question, which is about reading. And I feel like I'm based in Brazil, and I tell people that I was really shocked at the figures, the statistics that came out a couple of months ago, showing that we don't have a lot of readers, like people who claim they haven't picked up a single book in 1 year, most of the population now. And with, social media, mobile devices, and AI, it feels that it's actually getting worse, that people, they get bored very quickly, they cannot even read a whole page. What do you think about that? Because reading is an amazing source of, information, knowledge. Even there's research about how extended reading can help you with vocabulary acquisition, with empathy, if you're reading a novel and things like that. So how do you feel about that, Barbara? Students not reading so much.
The Matthew effect, which is, to those who have, it's easier to get more. Yeah. If you read when you're young, it's easier to just keep that habit up and to really develop your cognition. When you are taught using ways that cripple students' abilities to read effectively, as with whole language approaches, which were everywhere in Western educational systems, it was such a paradigm cartel that the only way to break it in the U.S. has been oftentimes for state governments to come in and say, you will pay attention to the research. You will actually insist on students learning phonics before they do whole language kinds of approaches. And so a lot of times what you'll hear from educators is this sort of, well, gee, students aren't reading it. It's really, isn't that terrible? Yeah. Instead of, it's the education system that has made it more difficult for students to learn how to read early on. And now we're just seeing the upshot as they ripple through the system. So it's an indictment of the education system. And this needs to change, especially because, there's some systems in the world that have not fallen prey to these deceptively simple, make student happy approaches that really don't ultimately make students happy because they haven't learned effectively.
Yeah, and that brings me to the final section of this talk, because since we're talking about reading and you have such a diverse background, you've done all sorts of things, growing up. I wonder how reading played a part maybe in getting you interested in science. And were you a major nerd growing up? Did you like reading about science and or even novels, something like that?
I was kind of a bit of a funny nerd. When you move all the time, it after a certain age, if you're a little bit shy, you start becoming more and more shy because, you're introverted. Then you move to, I moved from Texas, so I'm talking like this. And then I moved to Malibu, California. Wow. And suddenly I have the wrong genes, the wrong accent, the wrong everything. But at the same time, my father was a veterinarian. So starting when I was about 10 years old, we had horses. Oh. So I would just go out and ride and ride all the time. So I would either A, read, or B, ride. And so that gave me, I guess, a lot of diffuse time. One thing I did do was I liked science fiction. I liked history. Yeah. I liked a lot of different, like spy novels and so forth. I didn't read to the extent of getting into math or science, except in the easy ways it was presented in science fiction novels.
Yeah.
My claim to fame is that my father was the veterinarian for Frank Herbert, the author of Dune. So,
Yes. Wow.
yeah. So I got him. I have a signed copy of Dune. And,
Really? Wow.
but
Amazing.
yeah, by the Frank Herbert. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I think that reading really did help keep the door open for learning. And then moving to many different places kind of kept me. Here's what it did for me. It helped me to grow comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So then when you move to a new place, after a while, it's like, oh, I miss where I was. And then you're realizing, I'm always doing this. I'm always missing where I was. Why don't I enjoy it while I'm actually here?
Sure.
But also, you learn that you're kind of the odd person out sometimes in how you think about things.
Yeah.
And so then that means that thinking like everybody else doesn't become so important because you're kind of used to, them thinking, well, you're always the odd one out, because you're thinking in a different way. You don't talk right anyway.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make you necessarily be annoying, although I suppose sometimes it can turn out that way, but it just makes you more comfortable. If people don't like what you're saying, you're used to it.
Yeah.
And it helps you to think, a lot of what goes on is just groupthink. Like in education, it's groupthink. Everybody else believes it, so you believe it. Yeah. And it's really hard. I was just talking with someone and they were saying, oh, well, their students use ChatGPT to help them. And they found that flashcards were not effective at all for them. Oh. And I was like, yeah, what was really going on. She doesn't like flashcards. So they were making her happy in finding what she clearly wanted them to find. Yeah. So that kind of thing goes on so often in educational research. They'll get a good idea, they're convinced it's right, and they will set their studies up to show they are right and not to show anything else.
Yeah, confirmation bias, right? Yeah.
So much. Yeah.
And I think the last question I'm going to ask you, Barbara, I don't want to take more of your time, is really, are you, because, you've just published the paper and it looks like you're still very active, doing the work and what are you doing exactly now? Are you still doing research? Are you working on a new book? Any spoilers for us?
I have so many things going on that it's so. Yeah. Tomorrow I will have a new massive open online course being released on Coursera. It is on free speech and the importance of free speech.
Wow!
Yeah. And it is not your grandmother's version of free speech. Sure. Only for people who, we don't want to hurt people's feelings. It is not that kind of course, but it is a course on how to listen to people you don't agree with. To at least learn why they think the way they think. And so that important. Is such an important skill. And so it's, and I, not to malign grandmothers, because I'm a happy grandmother, this course is actually for our granddaughter and for the many young people who really have not been taught, because there's a lot of motives for people to want people to dislike free speech. Yeah. Because, it may gore your own ox. And so governments can say, well, speech it's okay only if you don't say what we don't want you to say. Yeah. So anyway, that course is coming out tomorrow. At the end of this month is another course on making math click. So if you're uncomfortable with math, it teaches you how to understand math. And even if you're a teacher of math and you're uncomfortable with it, how can you teach it and help people
Nice.
to acquire it better? And then I have all these papers and everything I'm working on, and my husband and I are going to like 6 countries over the next month, and so
Wow.
we have so many things going on. I'll be presenting in many of these countries, so in fact, almost every one of them. So it's an exciting time. I just keep feeling that the more you learn, the more doors open for you, and the more you're able to do work that others can find really helpful.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing. You're keeping busy, huh? That's amazing. Well, Barbara, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. You know, like I said, I'm honored. It's like I said, weird that I have the opportunity to talk to so many amazing people who have done so much for education and teaching and learning, and here you are. So again, thank you so much for saying yes.
My pleasure. Thank you, Andre, for asking me. And it's been really, really fun to speak with you.
Well, thank you so much. And folks, stay tuned for the next episodes of the Learning Cosmos podcast.